Trump considers himself the ultimate, alpha. He's the big guy. And Putin considers himself the ultimate alpha, the big guy. And I don't know how that's going to play itself out because Trump can't subordinate himself to Putin, and Putin can't subordinate himself to Trump. And I can imagine them trying to come up with some deal that looks good for a few minutes. But if Trump looks bad, or if he's made to look bad among Americans by something that Putin does, he could come down even harder than anybody.
If he enjoyed the support that he claims he does, he wouldn't have to have the hundreds and hundreds of arbitrary detentions that he does and the extrajudicial executions. And I think shining a spotlight on that in the context of negotiations is a great way of ensuring that Putin's propaganda is mitigated and that a spotlight is shown on those who are opposing him internally.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And it is great to welcome back Bill Browder today, who is the founder of the Magnitsky Awards, along with leading international human rights lawyer Brandon Silver. Welcome to both of you. Now, Bill, you will already know because he's a regular here on Frontline. We've often talked about Putin's Russia, the war in Ukraine, and of course, his friend, the recently released political prisoner Vladimir Kara-Murza. A bit more about Brandon, though. Brandon is the founding director of policy and projects at the Canada-based Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. He works to free political prisoners, fight human rights abuses and corruption, and he will be presented with the accolade for outstanding human rights lawyer at this week's 10th Magnitsky Human Rights Awards in London. It's great. Congratulations, Brandon. Great to see you here. Now, you have recently said that Russia's aggression against Ukraine is the violent expression of President Putin's assaults on the rules-based order and those who defend it. Can you kind of explain a bit more about what you mean there?
Sure. Well, firstly, thanks for having me, Kate. It's a privilege to be here with you. And, I think Vladimir Kara-Murza, the recently released dissident, said it best that the internal mass domestic repression, the extrajudicial executions, the arbitrary detentions, some of the highest since the height of the Soviet Union under Stalin's era, that was allowed to go unchecked in breach of international norms and international guarantees, treaties that both Putin's Russia, but also the UK, Canada, and other democracies have subscribed to, and where all of us have an obligation to fight these rights violations, to fight for these freedoms. They've only been honored in their breach. And I think that sent a sign to Putin that if he can conduct this mass domestic repression and these international legal breaches domestically, then he can do that externally as well, that this domestic repression can morph into external aggression, and that will not abate until there's a much more concerted international response.
President Putin jumped on the election of President Trump to, in his congratulations speech, promote the idea of this new world order as he sees it. He said he was ready to talk. What part do you think those talks will play, not only in the future of Ukraine, but also the stability of other countries, their security around the world, and the organizations that underpin democracy?
Well, we must not forget all those on the front lines in Russia that continue to fight against this illegal and unjustified aggression against Ukraine, and to fight against all those internal repressions that I mentioned that underpin it all. And any negotiations that may be suggested, any discussions that happen, need to highlight those voices inside that are going to be the future of a democratic Russia that one day will indeed prevail thanks to the bravery of these, Russian dissidents and, the brave Ukrainians that are repelling this invasion. So while this is something that's been suggested as bilateral or multilateral, the priority is to make sure that those human rights and dissident voices are the ones that are highlighted therein.
The world is now looking at what a new President Trump will decide or try to do in terms of a deal over the future of Ukraine with President Putin. Difficult to say exactly, because already the counter kind of messaging is going from the Kremlin and from the other side of the Atlantic. What do you see at the moment? What do you think might happen?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen, but I can sort of read some tea leaves for you. So there's like messaging coming out of the Trump camp, and they've got some fantasy about what they think a settlement should look like, and the fantasy as of right now is there's a demilitarized zone. They draw a thing on the map, and the demilitarized zone would be defended by European troops. Nobody's gotten any agreement from Europe on that. That Ukraine would not be part of NATO, and so on and so forth. And this is their fantasy, and I've read about it in various articles and on Twitter and so on and so forth. And it might be their fantasy, but Putin doesn't have any intention of that's not Putin's fantasy. Putin, he wants total capitulation. And part of the reason that Putin started this war, or the main reason Putin started this war, is a way of being at war to distract the Russian people so they're not mad at him. They're mad at a foreign enemy. And so it's kind of a fantasy to say, okay, here's our idea, and to expect that Putin is going to accept that idea. Nobody's consulted with Putin, or maybe Trump has. I don't know. There's been some secret phone calls that right, exactly. But it would seem to me that whatever the fantasy is, coming out of Washington or Palm Beach, Florida, Mar-a-Lago, that's not necessarily how Putin is going to think. And I think Putin probably isn't going to do whatever they've laid out here. And so I think it's a lot more complicated than anybody is.
And of course, President Zelensky will have his own ideas,
as
he should.
And of course he's going to have his own ideas. And he's got 900,000 soldiers, and they're producing 4 million drones a year, and they've annihilated 700,000 Russian soldiers. And they're protecting their people from unbelievable murder and terrorism and hardship. And then of course the Europeans have their own ideas. And you've got Keir Starmer meeting with Macron and Scholz. You've got the Polish foreign minister saying we're going to create, or the Polish prime minister saying we're going to create our own coalition to stand up against Ukraine, which is going to consist of the UK, Poland, the Baltics, Scandinavian countries, etc. This is not something where Trump can unilaterally decide, here's my plan, everyone's going to accept it, because everyone's got their own interests, and their own interests are a lot different, potentially different than his interests.
Brandon?
Yeah, and one thing, as I mentioned earlier, that the human rights community and Russian dissidents are fighting for us to make sure that the interests of the pro-democracy movement are represented in any discussions. While that might not be present in some of the interests of various state actors, even democratic ones, I think we need to be talking about it and making sure that becomes part of the conversation, that inevitably there'll likely be prisoner exchanges, prisoners of war and the like, but we can't forget about political prisoners and their release, which I think will be an important way of undermining Putin's propaganda about domestic support for his war. If he enjoyed the support that he claims he does, he wouldn't have to have the hundreds and hundreds of arbitrary detentions that he does and the extrajudicial executions. And I think shining a spotlight on that in the context of negotiations is a great way of ensuring that Putin's propaganda is mitigated, and that a spotlight is shown on those who are opposing him internally, and that maybe we even help secure their freedom in these kinds of negotiations.
Bill, Brandon here has won the Outstanding Human Rights Lawyer at the Magnitsky Awards. Can't really do justice to all the things that he has done in his career so far, but could you just kind of summarize for us, because I know he'll probably be too modest to say himself.
Well, he's definitely too modest, so I'm going to do I'm going to be his spokesman for what he's accomplished. But basically, when we ran around the world, first to get justice for the murder of Sergey Magnitsky, my lawyer, and then afterwards to try to free Vladimir Kara-Murza from prison, I went to different countries doing different things. But one of the countries where I had the biggest impact, and that country having the biggest impact on our worldwide campaign, was Canada. There's an interesting joke that I tell, which is that when the Magnitsky Act was passed in America, a lot of countries didn't want to follow America because there's sort of either subtle or maybe even explicit sense of anti-Americanism. But there's no such thing as anti-Canadianism. And so we went to Canada to get the Magnitsky Act passed, and there was one person in Canada. That's where
you met Brandon, is it?
That's where I met Brandon. And then there's one person in Canada who made it all happen. So I should say Brandon and his colleague Erwin Kotler. Erwin is the sort of Grand Dean of Human Rights, and Brandon is this young buck. And together, they made everything happen. And so we ended up getting a unanimous vote for the Magnitsky Act in 2017, both unanimous in both houses of parliament. When Vladimir Kara-Murza was arrested and put on trial for 25 years for, quote, treason, Brandon organized, so Canada was the first country to use the Magnitsky Act, which we got passed to sanction the people who were persecuting Vladimir Kara-Murza. When it became clear that there was we needed more countries involved in fighting for Kara-Murza's release, Brandon was one who organized this ingenious idea, which is that Canada has this little-known procedure where you can get honorary Canadian citizenship for people, and it's been used 7 times.
I remember that hitting the news
Yeah.
when he was Vladimir was awarded a Canadian citizenship. That's right, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Canadian citizenship.
So only 7 times has ever been done before. Nelson Mandela, Malala, Dalai Lama. And Brandon came up with this idea and then ran with it in Canada. I came to Canada along with Vladimir Kara-Murza's wife Eugenia, and Brandon had it all figured out. And so, you know, I've worked with a lot of people in a lot of places, and I should say that you know, Brandon is one of my favorite people in the world. But we have a committee for the Magnitsky Awards, and his nomination didn't come from me. It came from like 2 other members of the committee, and it was unanimous. Like, everybody knew Brandon and said, this is a guy, you know, he may not be, you know, world known now, but he should be, and he will be, hopefully, with the Magnitsky Award.
And Brandon, when Vladimir Kara-Murza was awarded Canadian citizenship, what effect did it have? What reaction was there from the Kremlin?
I remember during the campaign to accord Vladimir Kara-Murza honorary Canadian citizenship, the Russian embassy issued a press release, and the Russian ambassador to Canada started personally reaching out to journalists saying, headline, "This is not a news story," which sort of speaks you know, for itself in terms of the worry they had about this campaign and their efforts to try to stymie it.
Let's rewind, talk about Sergey Magnitsky, because not everybody will know the story quite so well as you obviously do, because you've lived it. He was killed in pre-trial detention in Russia, died when he refused to give up his investigations into Interior Ministry officials for fraud and corruption. Can you tell me a little bit about the idea that you actually had to bring the people that were responsible for his death and responsible for the corruption to justice? How did it come about exactly?
Well, so Sergey was my lawyer. He exposed this massive crime in retaliation for exposing this massive crime of $230 million of theft of tax money, Russian government money. He exposed it and was then arrested by the same people he exposed, tortured for 358 days, and killed in Russian police custody 15 years ago, November 16, 2009, at the age of 37. And it was such an affront to me and heartbreak for me that my lawyer was killed, that I went on this mission to get justice. And we tried to get justice inside of Russia, and the Putin regime completely circled the wagons. They said Sergey Magnitsky was the crook, that nobody tortured him, nobody mistreated him, he died of natural causes. And then Vladimir Putin got involved, and personally got involved in the cover-up and the obstruction of justice. And so we said, if we can't get justice inside of Russia, we need to get justice outside of Russia. And that's when we came up with this idea of freezing their assets and banning their visas, which became known as the Magnitsky Act. It was passed in the United States in 2012, and then in Canada in 2017. And it's now gone on to be operational and effective in 35 different countries. And it really is now one of the most important tools for international justice and human rights around the world.
Brandon, can you tell us a little bit more about how does that actually work in practice? How do you identify the individuals? How do you put A and B together to actually make that happen?
Sure. Well, it relies very heavily on, you know, journalists and courageous activists who are reporting on the crimes and those responsible for them, and put together, basically based on that information, legal briefs under the relevant legislation, the Magnitsky laws, that the government considers. In each jurisdiction it's different, but in Canada there's a rigorous legal process with judicial oversight and the like, and ultimately driven by political decision makers at the end, which makes Bill's advocacy and that of Vladimir Kara-Murza all the more important and remarkable, is that this is something that's driven by people, by activists, and that is the only way that the perpetrators can see justice and that we can ensure accountability. A lot of these perpetrators deny their compatriots at home the rights that they like to enjoy abroad. So the beaches and banks that they like to access in the Western world should at the very least be off limits, and grateful to Bill for having led that campaign. And in your story about the unanimous passage in Canada, we should also, ironically give credit to Vladimir Putin himself, who had intervened, as Bill said, took this as a personal affront and mission to try to block the Magnitsky Act from being passed. And I remember when Bill and Vladimir Kara-Murza were campaigning alongside Professor Kotler in Canada, we had formed an all-party parliamentary caucus, bringing together the leading elected officials from all parties. And as we were trying to see where the votes would land, Vladimir Putin came out and gave a press conference in Russia saying he's following the vote in Canada and will be taking names and looking at how people vote. So afterwards, we just sent that clip to members of parliament and said, now you know how you have to vote if Vladimir Putin's watching. And it passed unanimously after that.
Well, in fact, people have always said to me, who's the best advocate for the Magnitsky Act around the world? And, wanting to know, is it me, is it Kara-Murza or something like it? And the answer is no, it's Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, every time he would do something outrageous and horrible, it would just get everybody more and more determined to make sure that he didn't get away with it.
And Bill, when Magnitsky sanctions are imposed, what kind of effect does it have on the Kremlin? What reaction do you get from Vladimir Putin? Do you ever sense a direct result?
They get so angry. It's so first of all, the person who's sanctioned, their financial lives are ruined at that very moment. No bank will touch them. Credit cards are getting canceled. They can't buy anything online. They can't travel anywhere. Their lives. The drug dealers of Colombia came up with a word for this because they were the first ever to be sanctioned. It's called muerte civil, which means civil death. You become a non-person. And of course, if you're a Kremlin crony, your whole modus operandi, your whole objective in life was to steal money, live a luxurious life, travel to London, to Paris, to Aspen, all these great things. And all of a sudden you can't do that. That's like a really terrible thing. But the second thing, which is even more interesting and what I find really satisfying as one of the main advocates behind the Magnitsky Act is that it doesn't just affect the person who's sanctioned, but it affects everybody else around them who are desperately afraid that they're going to be next. And so this is kind of like counterterrorism, but this is terrorism in its own way. Everybody becomes terrorized that they might be next on the sanctions list because it's so devastating for these people. And so everybody is wondering, am I going to be next? How do I keep my head down? We had a situation where it was in the summer, and we were fighting some part of the Magnitsky case, and the judge who was normally doing all the really nasty stuff that the judges do, taking instructions on the telephone from the Kremlin, he was on vacation, and there was a new judge. And the new judge desperately, so there was some filing, and he had to make a ruling, which was surely going to be against us. But he didn't want to make the ruling because he didn't want to find himself on the Magnitsky list. And so he found every possible way of delaying it until the other guy came back from his vacation. But the point is that it sows terror in the minds of corrupt officials, human rights violators, and autocrats. And that's a very satisfying thing for us on this side of the barricade.
And Brandon, palpably, what kind of a difference has it actually made being able to implement this against individuals? Have you seen actual tangible results?
Yes, and firstly, its implementation is all the testament to its usefulness and effectiveness. Since it's been adopted in Canada, it's been used over 1,000 times. So 1,000 individuals and entities have been named, shamed, and had their assets blocked, which not only is a way of standing in solidarity with these human rights defenders, but is a way of protecting our own sovereignty and our own national security from the corrosive effects of this corrupt foreign capital and foreign interference from some of the worst rights violators and abusers in the world. So again, just through its implementation in Canada over 1,000 times and in other jurisdictions quite vigorously, we're ensuring that our economies, our political systems are safeguarded from this foreign interference, and that we're sending a very strong message. And I'd like to add as well, when we target it in very specific ways, using it to, elevate the cases and causes of political prisoners, of hostages, it actually helps improve their situations. I had the privilege of meeting with Vladimir Kara-Murza for the first time since his release, a friend and mentor and someone I respect immensely. And he said, the talk of sanctions surrounding his case and singling out the individuals, whether it's the false witnesses, the jailers, the judges, actually had the effect of deterring what could have been, as horrific as the situation was, something even worse. It improves prison conditions, it improves the situations of those arbitrarily detained, and it sends a message to the rights violators that the world is watching and that there is not going to be impunity for their crimes.
So just tell us a little bit about how you heard and came across Vladimir Kara-Murza and what you actually did to secure his release in August in that prisoner exchange.
Well, Vladimir is someone I respect immensely, a leading Russian public intellectual and dissident who was a key part of the Magnitsky campaign along with Bill Browder. And, we first crossed paths in that way. Canada was the beneficiary of his great intellect and advocacy, where he'd often be in Ottawa and we'd host him for parliamentary testimony, public events, just to raise a lot of the terrible crimes that were going on in Russia, discuss the political prisoners who needed the world's attention, and ways that Canada can improve its foreign policy to stand with those who need that support, including in particular through the adoption of Magnitsky laws. And as I got more involved in other international cases, Vladimir was just a constant presence on the international scene. Whatever human rights conference you'd go to, whatever parliament you'd visit, whatever democratic gathering, Vladimir was always a respected keynote speaker, interlocutor, someone who was shaping conversations, whether prominently on the stage or quietly in his own way behind the scenes. So I had the privilege over the years of getting to know him and calling him a friend and mentor, and he'd always make himself available to offer advice, guidance about how to just improve the situation of human rights.
Did you advise him not to go back to Russia when he did and when he got incarcerated?
Everybody who knows him and cares about him and his work, but had strongly urged that he not. But it's just a testament to his bravery and courage that he'd always say, if the Russian people are standing up against Putin, I need to be there with them to help lead this fight.
Really interesting. It was, we've talked about Vladimir Kara-Murza many times, and when he was released, well, to me it came as a surprise. Why would President Putin risk letting somebody who's so vocal against him out?
Well, it'd be interested to hear your thoughts, Bill, but I think it comes down to, the effectiveness of the Magnitsky campaign more generally and what it stands for, that ultimately they're made to feel the pressure. And the scales tip at a point when it costs them more to keep him in prison than to release him. And I think the pressure was mounting. The international opprobrium was growing such that, they were able to save face by getting some people that they wanted, but that ultimately, and I come back to this because I think it's so important in broader discussions about hostage negotiations or negotiations more generally, that it's not just about what the other side wants, but about how to increase the amount of pressure, whether that's in terms of rhetoric, like honorary citizenship and just, again, talking about it, or the hard economic pressure that Bill so masterfully marshaled internationally in terms of finding their assets, where they like to vacation, and just cutting that at the source.
There's one other last thing, which is Putin desperately wanted this guy, Vadim Krasikov, the tea garden killer. This is in Germany. Yeah. For some reason, Putin had that guy was just so important, a high-value prisoner, that he was ready to do almost anything to get that guy, including letting Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was his most despised political prisoner. They gave him the longest sentence of any political prisoner in Russia to Vladimir Kara-Murza. So it speaks to the value of this particular killer who they really wanted out.
And also, I think, speaks to our values as democratic nations, as Kara-Murza always said, that we value life. That, if you look at who was traded on either side, you've got human rights activists, dissidents, journalists, and Putin was asking for serial killers and spies. So I think that just talks about the clash of values here and what we're really fighting for at the end of the day.
You're very experienced in working towards the release of political prisoners and hostages, as well as working to help Palestinians persecuted by Hamas. You're also working towards the release of those held by Hamas in Gaza. In general terms, just very general terms, how much influence can you have on prisoner and hostage release?
Well, it's really important to just discuss all those that are currently languishing in torture dungeons. And we just saw videos recently released of Hamas torturing Palestinian dissidents, members of the LGBT community, women's rights activists. And, you referenced some of our work with them. We helped facilitate the escape of some of these Palestinian refugees to Canada. And I think just talking about their stories, about the remaining 101 hostages, not only Israelis, but over 25 different nationalities who were targeted by Hamas, as in Hamas's charter, not only a genocidal anti-Semitism, but a attack on democracy and fundamental human rights norms that we need to address and ensure that it's, as a terrorist entity, pressured, sanctioned, and while negotiations are something that states are undertaking, it's the role of all democracies and citizens to talk about those that are suffering abuses as we speak in those terror tunnels and dungeons, and in pressuring the hostage takers and captors to ensure that this doesn't go unchallenged, and that inadvertently we don't contribute to it through, efforts that they undertake, whether through fundraising and the like.
And when you look at the situation in Ukraine now, how confident are you that those who are perpetrating human rights abuses will one day face justice, and it won't take tens of years to do so?
Well, just the act of, issuing these arrest warrants, of the important work that the UK has done in pursuing international justice, that multilateral institutions, that the US has done in the FBI and DOJ warrants that were issued, 6 were just issued for Hamas perpetrators, and a number on Ukrainian, those killing innocent Ukrainian civilians, whether it's Putin and his defense minister and Russian generals. And as we saw with Milosevic and other international rights abusers, they will one day see the inside of a courtroom. But until then, this kind of pressure is incredibly important. It continues to help shine an international spotlight on these abuses and make them the pariahs that they are. The international legal system and our own democratic norms have a role to play in ensuring justice, not only in the future, which will come one day, but right now, in making sure that these charges are aired publicly, and that there's a concerted campaign to pursue accountability.
Bill, when you see the growing confidence of President Putin on the world stage, and the way he hosted the BRICS summit recently inside Russia, he congratulated Donald Trump, travelled freely to Mongolia, wasn't arrested in spite of the fact that there is an international arrest warrant against him by the ICC. How do you feel? I mean, you're a man who's worked in Russia himself, and you see this man parading around with growing impunity. Do you feel confident that the law and that the democracy can catch up with him?
No, I don't. Remember, he went into Crimea in 2014, and then he showed up at the G20 summit in Australia, and nobody would sit with him at lunch. And we all thought, oh, fantastic, he's internationally isolated, he's an international pariah, nobody's ever going to talk to him again. And then people slowly forgot about Crimea and slowly forgot about all this stuff, nastiness in eastern Ukraine. And pretty soon he's back, back in action and in international conferences. And then he launches this murderous invasion of Ukraine. And then he's indicted. He becomes an indicted war criminal by the International Criminal Court. And again, we were throwing up our arms and cheering, finally justice is going to be done. Vladimir Putin, indicted war criminal. And then all of a sudden, as you say, there was this, BRICS conference, and Mongolia and all sorts of other, the Indian prime minister and the, Chinese president all coming and kissing the ring, and South Africans and all these things. And then, of course, Donald Trump. Donald Trump has been elected. And what's Donald Trump going to do with Putin? He's absolutely, at least people around him, and to a certain extent him himself, are legitimizing Putin. And so I'm not at all confident that, in spite of the, literally hundreds of thousands of murdered civilians in Ukraine, and murdered people in Russia that he's organized the murder of, I'm not at all confident, based on where we stand right now today, that that he's going to be isolated and held accountable.
Then how do you think the new administration in the US will impact the work that you do?
Well, if the Trump administration follows through on their pledge, which is to cut off military aid for Ukraine, Ukraine will be in a very desperate situation. And if Ukraine ends up in a desperate situation, Putin ends up in a better situation. And I could easily imagine a scenario where Putin, wins the war in Ukraine, however that win is defined. Mm. And I can imagine a scenario where Trump lifts sanctions against Putin. And
seriously, you can imagine that?
I can imagine that.
Can you, Brandon?
Well, I trust in the checks and balances of the U.S. democratic system, that the Congress, that you cultivate, and that remains such a strong ally to you and the Magnitsky campaign, will hopefully push back against these sorts of efforts. I trust and hope that it wouldn't be so easy to pursue such a wrong-headed policy, and that all those within the U.S., both civil society, elected officials, and the like, would make that a lot harder.
Yeah, well, we cross our fingers. I mean, the problem is that I don't think there's any chance that Trump could repeal the Magnitsky Act or repeal any of the laws that are in place which hold Putin to account. But Trump has every capacity, if he wants to take people off the sanctions list. That's within his complete control. He also has the capacity not to sanction more people. He has the capacity to. There's a lot of things. Brandon's absolutely right. In the United States, when it comes to domestic policy, it's all tied up with Congress and budgets and all that kind of stuff. But foreign policy is at the absolute discretion of the commander in chief, and that's. And by the way, I'm painting a very negative picture. There's one possible good outcome to this whole thing, which is that Trump considers himself the ultimate, alpha. He's the big guy, and Putin considers himself the ultimate alpha, the big guy, and I don't know how that's going to play itself out, because Trump can't subordinate himself to Putin, and Putin can't subordinate himself to Trump. And I can imagine them trying to come up with some deal that looks good for a few minutes, but if Trump looks bad, or if he's made to look bad among Americans by something that Putin does, he could come down even harder than anybody. You remember when Scholz and Macron, the Chancellor of Germany and the President of France, at the beginning, before the war started, they went and they were big apologists for Putin and appeasers, and they both went to Moscow. They met with Putin. Is he going to invade? Is he not? No, he's not going to invade. He assured me he wasn't. And then he invades. And these guys who were the ultimate appeasers became some of the staunchest, most tough critics. And so, as bad a picture as I might be painting, it could blow up in a bad way for Putin as well.
But Brandon, you were critical of the last G7 summit in Italy, saying that it was an opportunity for leading democracies to come together, but that they actually let dictators off the hook. How did they do that?
Well, a lot of critical solutions simply weren't on the agenda, especially when it comes to helping a lot of those on the front lines. There could be, at the next G7, which Canada is hosting, and we've had conversations with all parties, with the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, leader of the opposition, that supporting dissidents and hostages needs to be a priority, and democracies coming together needs to be something that the G7 focuses more concertedly on. And in practical terms, we see that all the major rights abusers, as Bill was just describing, are finding their own coalitions and ways of coming together, not just for meetings and conversations, but for sanctions evasions, which, as an aside, is a testament to the effectiveness of sanctions. The fact that Putin and his ilk need to be working so hard and so concertedly to find ways of getting around it shows that it does some damage. But they're looking for these methods and mechanisms. And I don't think democracies are working Similarly, one thing we propose is that there should be, a G7 Magnitsky task force. That Magnitsky should be on the agenda of the next G7 meeting, and a way of making sure that we work together collectively and more effectively on enforcement and implementation to make sure that there can't be sanctions flight, that if Canada or the UK sanctions a rights abuser, that they don't just move to another G7 country. And likewise for hostage advocacy. Something that Bill did so effectively for Vladimir, I think, is a model for the G7 more broadly, of making sure that all our democratic allies are talking together, working together to amp up the pressure on hostage takers and to see what could be done to help secure their release, instead of on a one-off bilateral way, to have a standing sort of NATO for hostage taking, that, an attack on one of us invokes a collective response.
Interesting idea. Just wanted to ask you, Brandon, your job and your work, it doesn't come without considerable personal risk. What drives you, and when is it you think that you actually achieved something? What makes it worthwhile for you?
Well, to the first point, the real risks are taken by those on the front lines who are seeking to defend, who put not only their livelihoods, but their very lives on the line in this struggle for justice and this common cause of protecting these shared democratic norms around the world. So the very least we could do in the freedoms that we enjoy in Canada, in the UK, is to stand up and speak up and work to help these people. Their leadership and their accomplishments is the greatest evidence of the impact of this work. Seeing Vladimir free, being able to talk to him, and then watching him take the stage and advocate for the hundreds of other political prisoners who remain behind bars in Russia. Or, seeing a brave Iranian dissident like Masih Alinejad, who braves repeated assassination attempts, but nonetheless continues her advocacy because so many people in Iran are deprived of that right and freedom to do so. So any chance we get to elevate these voices and to, support them in this struggle, I think is a win for all of us collectively and the freedoms we aspire to uphold.
Bill, Brandon will be presented with the Magnitsky Award for Outstanding Human Rights Lawyer on Thursday, the 14th this week, on the 15th anniversary of Sergey's death. It must be a very bittersweet moment for you.
Yeah, every year at this time, it really weighs heavy on me. Sergey Magnitsky was killed, in this exact week, 15 years ago, I still wear a very heavy burden on my shoulders for his death. If he hadn't been working for me, if he hadn't been fighting for justice for me and for his own Russian people, he'd still be alive. He was 37 when he died. He'd be in his 50s now, and that really that's a very heartbreaking thing. But there is a little bit of, there's some silver lining. Silver lining, maybe not the right word. There's some good has come from this. His sacrifice wasn't a meaningless, empty sacrifice. As a result of his death, there's now a law in 35 countries with his name on it. It's like a legal monument to Sergey Magnitsky, which allows other victims to hold their abusers to account and hopefully deters other people from doing terrible things. And the other thing that that Sergey Magnitsky's legacy has done is we've created this award in his name, the Magnitsky Award. And every year we honor 7 people who have taken risks to stand up to authoritarians and dictators like Sergey did, and have accomplished great things, and not just in Russia but around the world. And Brandon is one of them. He'll have 6 other compatriots this year, and it really is a time when we can recognize people who did great things in the spirit of Sergey Magnitsky, and his name will be remembered forever, both with the award and with the Magnitsky Act.
Bill Browder, Brandon Silver, so good to speak to you, and congratulations, Brandon. Good to see you.
Thanks very much, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.